He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Paraparaumu and Paraparaumu Beach, two towns on the Kāpiti Coast, just a 50-minute train ride from Wellington. Great nature walks, beaches and the gateway to Kāpiti Island. A good spot to take photos for the gram, you might say. And funnily enough, for most of the 20th century, when you heard the town names, you might hear several different versions, but that all rhyme with gram.
Pram, we're off to Pram for the day, we're off to Pram.
That's Kāpiti Coast District Council Cultural Advisor Kahu Ropata, who grew up with that name. Tourist operator John Barrett knows the name too.
If I go back to the late 40s, early 50s, Paraparaumu was pretty common.
And local business owner Craig Andrews says it still hasn't gone away.
I have heard it used quite often in the community.
Paraparaumu's an abbreviation that stuck, but it's a long way from the area's original Māori name, a name that stems from a key moment in Aotearoa's history. A name that still sparks a bit of debate, even in Te Reo Māori. We'll get into all that, but for John Barrett's tupuna, there was just one name and one pronunciation.
My old people, it always came out Paraparaumu.
This is Nau Mai Town, an RNZ podcast series. You may have picked up on the name Nau Mai, that's Naumai. In Te Reo Māori means welcome. Nau mai, hara mai. But we're also playing around with the English sound of the words because this series will help you know more about places all over the motu. Maybe your town. Ko Justine Murray aho, join me as we navigate the calm but at times choppy waters of Aotearoa place names.
We run a water taxi. We run a water taxi business to and from the island.
John Barrett's talking about Kāpiti Island, about 5 k's off the west coast in the Tasman Sea. The Barrett whānau have had a long association with the island, and as cliché as it sounds, home is where the heart is.
So I've lived around the Kāpiti Coast and Kāpiti Island for, 50 years, I suppose. 60 years. Well, 70 years, actually.
Oh, my gosh. 25 years ago, John and his family set up Kāpiti Island Nature Tours.
Our business out there is focused on the fantastic wildlife, basically, blended with that really rich historical narrative, and that historical narrative focuses around our iwi's arrival here in the 1820s, the rise of Ngāti Toa and the settlement of the Wellington district, conflicts with the New Zealand Company, the whole settlement. Kōreros, we find it interesting, and we find our visitors find it interesting as well.
The island has become a pest-free sanctuary for bird life.
It's been developing over the years as a fantastic bird sanctuary. No pests, no introduced pests, just forest and birds, basically. Increasing the number of kōkako from 5 to 205. Well, that's a success story, I suppose.
And in that time, he's witnessed a lot of change. But what about the name Paraparaumu? I mean, do people still call it that?
I don't hear it quite so much now as we used to. And look, I just think of it as a bygone era, really, a bit more of a colonial era sound. I'm just hearing less and less of it. I think it's just a natural progression in our development as a nation that, hopefully in my time, Paraparaumu will disappear altogether from the vocab, and it'll just be something of the past.
And it's in the past we need to explore to understand the origin of this name. We're heading back to 1819 to an event that has everything to do with the name Paraparaumu.
It is a name that is quite synonymous for our area. It wasn't until later on in life where I realised the significance of the name and how it recalls some major events in New Zealand history. So Paraparaumu, meaning parapara, is a word that we describe as waste or food waste or scraps, and umu meaning the earth ovens that they were cooked in. And so it's in reference to What we know is te āmio whenua tuatahi, te haeretanga mai o ngā puhi me Ngāti Tō ki te tonga. So around about 1818, 1819 was the first āmio whenua of Ngā Puhi when they came down from the Bay of Islands and coming all the way down to there. And so a lot of, it reminds us of that event.
Now, the first āmio whenua Kahu was talking about, Te Āmio Whenua Tuatahi, was an ambitious raid by Ngā Puhi from Northland and Ngāti Toa from Kāwhia. Now, it travelled down the west coast of the North Island all the way to Cook Strait. The words āmio whenua means to travel around or circle the land, but the taua or war party that came south in 1819 to 1820 weren't tourists. Now, this was an early foray of the musket wars, and the taua included Ngāti Toa Rangatira Te Rauparaha, his nephew Te Rangi Haiata, John Barrett's ancestor Te Rangi Hirua. Now, strategic alliances were made, but blood was also spilled along the way. When they reached the area now known as Paraparaumu, the war party was famished, but anticipating their arrival, the locals had scalped, leaving little behind, just
the scraps around the earth ovens all up and down those beaches at Paraparaumu all the way through to Otaki really, but Paraparaumu is the name where Ngā Puhi resided for a little while there, and their, I suppose, touring around Aotearoa, and of course they had the gun, and luckily enough with the gun gave them the ability to travel long distances with war parties, which probably hadn't really been done. You could quite often amass a big army, but to get through those different rohe, pre-European guns would have taken, but it would have been quite difficult. So I think they achieved probably what no other war party had achieved at that time, and that was from the hiku ki te upoko.
So Te Rauparaha and co were left with only scraps, but the area still left its impression. So much so that a couple of years later, when Ngāti Toa were under attack by enemies from the Waikato and King Country, Te Rauparaha brought all his people south.
For us as Ngāti Toa, Ātiawa Ngāti Raukawa, the centre of our universe, because it's where really everything started for us. So yeah, and of course Paraparaumu is the beach that lies directly across the ocean there. So very significant for us, yeah.
Which makes the name Paraparaumu seem, well, a little ridiculous. But we've probably heard similar stories. I mean, just down the road is Pai Kākariki, sometimes called a cringeworthy piecock. Craig Andrews runs the world-renowned Southwood Car Museum, a local business that began about 46 years ago. Think one giant roof with hundreds of old-school cars, like really old.
1895 Velo Benz.
That's Mercedes-Benz for you non-petrol heads. One of only two left in the world, supposedly. But I wanted to ask Craig about his town's name.
We don't really use Paraparaumu, but I have heard it used quite often in the community.
Yes. Where would you hear that name? Just in passing?
Just probably in passing, and people are actually talking about it, and mostly talking about it with a wee bit of a not quite so long a name, I guess.
And some Māori names are long, and they often have a story that relates to an ancestor or an event. While it's understandable to want to shorten a word, the price paid is that we lose the stories, the meaning. Kahu Ropata, remember, he's a cultural advisor for Kāpiti Coast District Council, says it just takes a bit of effort.
The blatant use of those barbarisms that we know, barbarisms or kupunene kara perhaps, i roti te reo Māori, where they go Pram or Paraparaumu. It's whether or not they can actually pronounce the name. That's one issue, Paraparaumu. And I don't really mind that if they can't pronounce it, because at least they're trying, especially our non-Māori, So I have a lot of time for that. It's when they carry on using the barbarisms like Pram. And I've been a teacher of Te Reo Māori for a long time, so I understand that language learning isn't that easy for some of our, even our own people, our own whānaus. So when you understand that's fine to say, as long as they try to say Paraparaumu, I'd accept a Paraparaumu, trying to thing, and I always encourage them to take up some lessons. But how I try and do it is just how I do correct in kōhanga at kura, by using the right example. So if somebody says, oh, we're off to Pram, oh, okay, are we off to Paraparaumu? And sort of do it that way in maybe a less confronting way.
Now, sometimes the te reo Māori pronunciation can vary. There's also different dialects or meta. With this name, I've heard it said Paraparaumu and Paraparaumu. Now, both mean the same. It's just said a bit differently. I ask John Barrett if there's a right or wrong.
There hasn't been any tikanga set as to the correct pronunciation as far as I'm aware, but for us it's Paraparaumu.
Located on the Kāpiti Coast, named after an event in 1819 where all the war party could find was scraps from a food oven. Parapara to mean scraps and umu, earth oven. Ko Ngāti Tua Rangatira, Ātiawa ki whakarongotai, Ngāti Raukawa ki te tonga, Ngā hapu o Ōtaki, Ngāti Haumia, te mana whenua. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thanks for listening to Nau Mai Town, written and produced by me, Justine Murray. Executive producer Tim Watkin and Liz Garton, engineers Phil Benge, William Saunders and Steve Burridge. Thanks to Kahu Ropata, John Barrett and Craig Andrews. Follow Nau Mai Town, that's Naumai, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio or wherever you access your podcasts.